Good afternoon, welcome to the Advaita Channel. I'm Bhagavati and today I'm reading from The Unborn, the life and teachings of Zen Master Bankai. I'm just going to post a link to this book in the chat, and if anyone's there who's got any problems viewing, then please let me know. In the chat, and if anyone's there who's just a short story about this book before we begin. I've chosen to read this book alongside the Ribhu Gita, which I read on Monday afternoons, because it was the teachings of Bankai that brought me to my current master, Muji, who you can see behind me here on my right. I came to him as a Zen teacher, as a trainee Zen teacher, and I was searching for someone with a deeper experience and understanding of the unborn, as I'd begun to discover it through my previous master, Daizan Roshi. And I was searching the internet and I came across Muji, just searching for the word unborn, master, teachings, anything, meditations. I was expecting maybe a Zen temple, a Zen master. But this is who came, and this is what came to me. And there's a very beautiful quote that I'd like to open with, which is actually from Muji, about the unborn. At a certain point, it will be impossible for you to go back to sleep, for you will have crossed over into the unborn. When I first came to him, I opened the conversation with him about Bankai, and from time to time I discussed with him this great teaching, which has been very influential in his own life also. So, without further ado, let me begin. A little background first for those who aren't familiar with Zen or with Bankai. Zen entered Japan at the time of the Southern Sung dynasty in China. Dogen, in 1200 to 1251, began to promulgate his version of Zen, which, although it came to be called Soto, the Japanese pronunciation of the Chinese Shaotung, is in fact Dogen's own Japanese Zen, which grew and developed around his main work, the Shobogenzo. The Rinzai sect, also introduced in the 13th century, brought to Japan the system and traditions of the Southern Sunglin Chi school. Beyond that, it didn't develop any characteristic Zen thought of its own worth of mention. Later, when we come to the Tokugawa period, 1603 to 1867, we see in the Koan Zen of Hakuin a new development in the methods or techniques of Zen practice, a new development, and also, in a sense, a systemization of Zen thought. However, slightly before Hakuin's time, Bankai appeared. His Unborn Zen espoused a fresh departure for the first time since the Zen patriarch, Bodhidharma. Unborn Zen is truly one of the most original developments in the entire history of Zen thought. Bankai must be considered one of the greatest masters that Japan has ever produced. These words were written by Daisetsu Suzuki in Studies of Zen Thought, Bankai Zen. In my own explorations of Bankai and the Unborn, I've since discovered that there's very much an existence of the understanding of the unborn, and many people striving to live in the unborn, in the Buddha mind. Since long before Bankai, outside of Zen, in many traditions it can be found in Christianity, it can be found in Vedanta, in Advaita, can even be found in the Tao. And today, many present-day teachers like Muji, like Adyashanti, are now giving teachings very much from the unborn. The Japanese Rinzai priest, Bankai Yutaku, did not leave behind any written exposition of his Zen teaching, and he gave strict orders that no one else was to reduce it to writing. And here we have a book. But records were made, nonetheless, his followers being unable to bear the thought that their master's words and deeds should go unrecorded, and, as one of them put it, just left for the sparrows to play around with. So grateful am I. So although much more was lost than they were able to commit to paper, we must be grateful for the record they have preserved for us, as it is our sole means of learning about his unborn Zen. I'd like to go one further than that and say that perhaps not our sole means, because the true means for us to learn about unborn and unborn Zen is through our own exploration of our true nature, our discovery of the self. But without the pointings of such a great teacher, how can we even begin? This account of Bankai's life and teaching begins with an introduction tracing the course of his religious career. It is based on material compiled by his disciples and on references that Bankai makes himself to his life in the course of his sermons. The Unborn. Bankai Yotaku was born in 1662, on the 8th day of the 3rd month, at Hamada, a small village on the shore of the inland sea, in the province of Haruma, in what is now eastern Hyogo Prefecture. His father, Suga, or Sugawara Dosetsu, was from the island of Shikoku. For generations, the family ancestors had been physicians of samurai rank in the service of the ruling Awa clan. For reasons not now known, Dosetsu resigned this post, and, as a masterless samurai, or ronin, crossed over the inland sea to the province of Bichu. There he married a Miss Noguchi and, after moving twice more, settled finally in Hamada, where he presumably gained a livelihood through the practice of medicine. Bankai was one of 9 children born to them, the 4th of 5 sons. His boyhood name was Muchi, which translates roughly as "don't fall behind." When Bankai was 10, his father died, leaving the duty of raising him and the other children to his mother and his eldest brother, Masayasu, who continued the family tradition as a practitioner of Chinese medicine. The records of Bankai's life reveal that he was an intelligent, highly sensitive child, but at the same time rather unruly and uncommonly strong-willed. His mother later told him that even at the young age of 2, he showed a distinct aversion to death. Namaste Anandi. The family found that by talking about death or pretending to be dead, they could stop his crying. Later, when he made a nuisance of himself by leading the neighbourhood children in mischief, the same methods were used to bring him into line. Every year, on the 5th day of the 5th month, the occasion of the Boys' Festival, the village youths took part in stone-throwing contests, dividing into sides and hurling small stones at each other from opposite sides of a nearby river. This annual event had been held in the district for over 500 years, since the Heian period, in order to inculcate mainly manly virtues in young boys. We're told that whichever side Bankai was on invariably won, because he would never retreat, no matter how hard the stones rained down on him. At the age of 11, less than a year after his father's death, he was sent to the village school, where he took an immediate interest in his studies. But the calligraphy lessons, held after school at a temple in a neighbouring village, were a different matter. For these he harboured an intense dislike. To avoid the monotony of copying and recopying Chinese characters from the teacher's copybook, he made a practice of returning home well before the class was over. Although Masayasu repeatedly took his young brother to task for this, his scolding had apparently little effect. In returning home, Bankai had to cross a river. His brother instructed the ferryman not to allow him to board if he should come along early. Bankai was not easily to be denied. The ground must continue under the water, he declared, and he strode right into the stream, struggling along over the bottom until he emerged, breathless, on the far bank. Wanting to avoid further conflict with his brother, Bankai thought of committing suicide. He had heard that eating poisonous spiders was fatal, so he swallowed a mouthful of them and shut himself up inside a small Buddhist shrine to await the end. Many hours later, seeing that he was still alive, he abandoned the attempt and went home. At the village school, Bankai was subjected to the same curriculum as all Tokugawa schoolboys: the recitation of Confucian texts over and over until they came automatically to the lips. One day, the class was taking up the Great Learning, one of the 4 books of Confucianism. The teacher came to the central words: "The way of great learning lies in clarifying bright virtue." Bankai interrupted the teacher. "What is bright virtue?" he asked. The teacher, repeating the glosses given in one of the traditional commentaries, answered, "The intrinsic nature of good in each person." Bankai asked what the intrinsic nature of man was, and was told it's his fundamental nature. "Then what is that?" he persisted. "The ultimate truth of heaven," replied the teacher. None of these answers satisfied Bankai. A deeper explanation was needed. He wanted to know what bright virtue meant in terms of his practical experience. This questioning marks the awakening of religious doubt in his consciousness, which was most likely already disposed in that direction because of the recent loss of his father. Bankai himself spoke of this critical juncture 60 years later as the beginning of his search to discover the Buddha mind. In any case, his questioning of bright virtue soon grew into an all-consuming passion. Fired by unquellable doubts, he embarked upon an urgent and relentless religious quest that would occupy the next 14 years and determine the future course of his life. At the beginning, he took every opportunity to ask others for help. A group of Confucian scholars, whom he pressed for an answer they were at a loss to give, suggested he tried Zen priests, because they know about such knotty problems. There were no Zen temples in the immediate vicinity, so he was unable to follow their advice. Bankai had to content himself with questioning more Confucianists and such Buddhist priests as he found in temples nearby. In addition, he attended every sermon, lecture, and other religious gathering that came to his attention. Afterwards, he would run home and tell his mother what had been said. But such inquiries brought him no glimpse of understanding. He was unable to find a single person who could offer him any guidance. Thoroughly discouraged, he wandered about like a stray mountain lamb, aimlessly and alone, in his own words. Now even his schoolwork lost all interest for him, a development so displeasing to his long-suffering brother that Bankai was finally banished from the family house for good. Namaste, Binan. Still only 11 years old, Bankai was on his own. If the records are to be believed, he does not seem to have been unduly troubled by this turn of events. On the contrary, he seems to have welcomed it as a chance to devote himself to his problem, secure from all outside distraction. In any case, a close friend of the family, taking pity on him, stepped forward and offered him the use of a small hut in the hills behind his house. Accepting the offer, Bankai wrote the words Shugyoan, or practice hermitage, on a plank of wood, propped it up outside the entrance, and settled down in earnest to devote himself to his own clarification of bright virtue. The records are more or less silent regarding the next several years. He seems to have spent some time at a temple of the Shin sect located close by. There he must have learned about that school's practice of the Nembutsu, the calling of the name of Amida Buddha. A reference in his sermons to long sessions devoted to the constant repetition of the Nembutsu, days on end in a Nembutsu samadhi, perhaps belongs in this period as well. When he was 15, Bankai lived for a while in a Shingon temple, where he presumably familiarized himself to some extent with the teachings and practices of esoteric Buddhism. The head priest of this temple, impressed by the young boy's resolution, tried to induce him to stay on as his disciple. Bankai refused the offer. Neither the Shin nor the Shingon sect was to his liking. The next year, having turned 16, he walked the 20 miles that separated Hamada from the city of Akko to visit the Zuyoji, a temple of the Zen sect that had been built 22 years before for the incumbent abbot, Umpo Zenjo. Umpo belonged to the Rinzai tradition. His specific filiation placed him in the mainstream of that school, which traced its descent from the great Zen masters of the Kamakura period, Daiyo and Daito. 70 years old when Bankai visited him in 1638. Umpo had earned a wide reputation as a stern taskmaster who demanded total dedication from his monks. A biographical notice of Umpo, included in Bankai's records, tells us that few were bold-hearted enough to enter his chambers, and they usually fled before long. I've seen this happen with our own master. Right off, Bankai told Umpo of the difficulty he was having in coming to terms with bright virtue. Umpo replied that if he wanted to discover what it meant, he would have to practice Zazen, seated meditation. There must have been something about Umpo and the Zen teachings and the practice he embodied that struck a responsive chord in Bankai, because then and there he asked Umpo to give him ordination as a Buddhist monk. Umpo, no doubt pleased to grant this request, coming as it did from such an obviously determined young man, immediately shaved Bankai's head. He gave him the religious name Yotaku, meaning long polishing of the mind gem. Bankai, the name by which he is best known, he acquired in his early 30s, when he served a term as a teacher in the training halls of Myoshinji in Kyoto. Although we have no specific information about the way in which Umpo instructed Bankai, we can reasonably assume that Bankai was subjected to a demanding training program during the 3 years he was under Umpo's guidance. Zazen was, of course, the chief ingredient of training. Bankai probably did some work on koans as well, although no clear evidence reveals this, and there is some indication that Umpo may not have laid the same stress on koans that his contemporaries did. At 19, after 3 years at the Zuyoji, Bankai set out, heading east, on an extended journey around the country that eventually took him throughout the Kyoto-Osaka area and as far west as the island of Kyushu. Once he took leave of Umpo, he had no fixed residence. He stayed in temples, but more often he lived a solitary life, in rude self-made huts, or frequently, to judge from his records, he merely slept in the open. The privations of this life were great, but he faced them with a more than Spartan disdain for hunger and extremes of season and temperature. He is reported to have lived among beggars for several years, first under the Gojo Bridge in Kyoto, and later beside the Tenmangu Shrine in Osaka, where he slept with nothing but reeds for a covering. He sat for a week, without eating, at the Matsununu shrine in the western part of the capital. From the following account by Bankai himself, we can form a picture of what his life was like at this time, although the disciple who cites it adds that it tells but 1/10,000th of the actual circumstances. So here we have it in Bankai's own words. I pressed myself without mercy, draining myself mentally and physically. At times, I practiced deep in the mountains, in places completely cut off from human contact. I fashioned primitive shelters out of paper, pulled that over me, and did zazen seated inside. I would make a small lean-to by putting up 2 walls of thick paper boards and sit in solitary darkness inside, doing zazen, never lying down to rest even for a moment. Whenever I heard of some teacher whom I thought might be able to give me advice, I went immediately to visit him. I lived that way for several years. There were very few places in the country I did not set foot. When he went back to Umpo in 1645, after 4 years' absence, Bankai was 23 years old, and still no closer to resolving the doubt and incertitude pressing in upon him. He is said to have been weeping in discouragement, as he told Umpo how he had been unable to find a single person in all his travels who could give him the kind of help he wanted. Umpo's reply was, "It's your desire to find someone that keeps you from your goal." He was telling Bankai that he would never be able to achieve enlightenment as long as he persisted in searching for an answer outside himself. How very true. The words seemed to have their intended effect. Bankai promptly left again. This time he stayed nearby, building a hermitage in the countryside to the north of Akko Castle. As if to underscore his determination to accomplish his end entirely on his own, he isolated himself completely from contact with the outside, walling himself up within his tiny dwelling. He sat constantly, day and night, dedicating himself with even greater urgency to zazen, resolved, just as the Buddha before him had been, not to get up until he had found the way through. Eventually, his buttocks and thighs became inflamed and swollen from constant contact with the bare rock floor. They began to fester. Still he kept sitting. He gave up eating for weeks at a time. He threw cold water over himself whenever he felt the slightest approach of the demons of sleep. Here is one of several descriptions we have of life in his hut. The room, about 10 feet square, resembled nothing so much as a prison cell. There was only one small opening, just large enough for an arm to pass through. The door he plastered shut with mud, so that no one could enter to bother him. Food was passed to him through the hole in the wall twice each day. After he had finished eating it, he placed the bowl outside the opening once again. A privy was arranged just below the wall, so that he could relieve himself from inside the room through a small aperture made for that purpose. But the long years of struggle had weakened him, both physically and mentally. He contracted tuberculosis. He tells of it himself in this famous passage from his sermons. The adverse effects of the long years of physical punishment built up and finally led to serious illness. My illness steadily worsened. I grew weaker and weaker. Whenever I spat, gouts of bloody sputum as big as thumb heads appeared. Once I spat against a wall, and the globules stuck and slid to the ground in bright red beads. The illness now reached a critical stage. For a whole week, I could not swallow anything except for some thin rice broth. The physician who examined him is reported to have thrown aside his medicine spoon. Bankai was past the point where such remedies could be of help. He was now resigned to dying. But with things at their blackest, his dramatic personal struggle to attain enlightenment came to an end. In his own words again, I felt a strange sensation in my throat. I spat against a wall. A mass of black phlegm, large as a soapberry, rolled down the side. Suddenly, just at that moment, I realized what it was that had escaped me until now. All things are perfectly resolved in the unborn. After 14 years of incredible hardship, he had achieved a decisive enlightenment, his doubts and uncertainties disappearing like a dream. Immediately, he felt his strength begin to return. His appetite improved, almost miraculously, and with it, his health. Soon after this, according to the accounts given in two of the biographical records, another enlightenment occurred, occasioned when the fragrant smell of plum blossoms was borne to him on the morning breeze, as he was washing his face in a nearby stream. One version of the story links this second experience to the first one in the following way. The Master, frustrated in all his attempts to resolve the feeling of doubt which weighed so heavily on his mind, became deeply disheartened. Signs of serious illness appeared. He began to cough up bloody bits of sputum. He grew steadily worse, until death seemed imminent. He said to himself, "Everyone has to die. I'm not concerned about that. My regret is dying with the great matter I've been struggling with for all these years, since I was a small boy, still unresolved." His eyes flushed with hot tears. His breast heaved violently. It seemed his ribs would burst. Then, just at that moment, enlightenment came to him, like the bottom falling out of a bucket. Immediately his health began to return, but still he seemed unable to express what he had realized. Then one day, in the early hours of the morning, the scent of plum blossoms, carried to him in the morning air, reached his nostrils. At that instant, all attachments and obstacles were swept from his mind, once and for all. The doubts that had been plaguing him ceased to exist. When he was strong enough to travel, he made his way to the Zuyoji to tell Umpo what had happened. Umpo was overjoyed. "That is the marrow of Bodhidharma's bones. From now on, no one anywhere will be able to touch you," he said, acknowledging Bankai's understanding. He told him, however, that he should obtain verification from other masters. Gudo Toshiku, the most highly regarded Rinzai Zen teacher of the day, was the man Umpo recommended. Bankai, who was now 26, proceeded to the province of Mino, now the Gifu prefecture, where Gudo's temple, the Daisenji, was located, midway between Hamada and Edo. Gudo, whose official duties obliged him to spend a good deal of time travelling around the country to the various temples under his supervision, was, by a stroke of bad luck, away in Edo. So Bankai could not avail himself of this eminent master's stock of experience. Having come that far, however, Bankai decided to try his luck with some of the other Zen teachers in the vicinity. What he discovered, to his disappointment, and a little to his disgust as well, was that none of the men he visited was in a position to give him the confirmation he was after. In fact, Bankai quotes in his sermons a confession one of these priests made to him, to the effect that what he taught people was not based on his own enlightenment. He really was not enlightened, he said. He merely repeated what he had learned from his teacher, or what he had been able to grasp from his reading of Zen writings. He even praised Bankai for being able to see through his lack of true attainment. Bankai seems to have spent the next year or so in a series of small hermitages built at different sites amongst the forested hills of Mino, as he applied himself to the important post-enlightenment phase of the training. He returned to Harima in 1650, where, into the following year, he apparently gave considerable thought to the course his future teaching activities should take. He contemplated, he says, the natural capacity of my fellow men, and the means by which they could best be instructed in the way. Trying to decide upon how best to transmit to others the understanding he had achieved. In the autumn of 1651, while Bankai was still engaged in this period of reflection, news reached him of a Chinese priest by the name of Dosha Chogun, who had arrived from China and was residing at a temple in the trading port of Nagasaki in western Kyushu. Umpo proposed that he go to Nagasaki and see what the Chinese priest had to offer. Bankai, who was still eager to find someone to confirm his enlightenment, probably needed little urging. Leaving Akko almost immediately, he travelled westward by water, begging a ride on one of the small trading vessels that plied the inland sea, and arrived at Nagasaki a week later. Dosha had landed in the 6th month of 1651. By autumn, the news of his arrival had reached Bankai's ears, and already within another month or so, we find him in Nagasaki. His initial interview with the Chinese master took place at Sofukuji, a large Chinese-style temple that had been built towards the beginning of the century on the slopes overlooking the harbour. During their first meeting, Dosha confirmed Bankai's enlightenment with the words, "You have penetrated through to the matter of the self." After having said that, however, he added, "But you still have to clarify the matter beyond, which is the essence of our school." To Bankai, who was brimming with self-confidence, this was inconceivable. So firm was his belief that he had attained great enlightenment itself, full and perfect. He thus refused, at first, to accept Dosha's evaluation, and told him as much. According to an account in Dosha's recorded sayings, Bankai looked at Dosha, laughed loudly, and then stalked brusquely out of the room without even making his bows. Still, he did not leave the temple. Instead, he stayed on for a few days, closely observing Dosha and the manner in which he instructed the monks under him. Bankai soon realized Dosha's true merit. He made up his mind to continue his practice at the Sofakuji. I would very much love to keep reading this for hours, but it's time to make space for another reader. Thank you for listening. I'll be reading again at the same time next week, the Unborn, and on Monday I'll be reading from the Song of Ribu, or the Ribu Gita, at 4 Central European Time, 3 London Time, 8:30 p.m. Bangalore Time. Thank you for listening. Om Shanti 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 Om. Pranams to our beloved masters, Muji, and to Ananta.